Welcome to this installment of Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. It's quite possible that you have visited the House of Commons and Parliament Hill more than once in your lifetime. It may have even been on a school trip. If you took a civics class when you were a student in school, you probably learned about the stages of passing a bill, the role of the Speaker, and the responsibilities of the House and Senate. What you probably did not learn about was the many outlandish antics that have taken place in Ottawa since members of Parliament began meeting there in 1867. My guest today has pulled together some of the most entertaining and outlandish happenings in the nation's capital in his new book, Unparliamentary, Tales from Canada's Colourful Parliamentary Past, published in 2026 by AVO UTP, an imprint of the University of Toronto Press. Winston Churchill once said that the purpose of Parliament is to substitute argument for fisticuffs, and in this book, we read about physical altercations, booze-fueled antics, protests, appeals, and many occurrences that were no doubt out of order. Charlie Feldman is the past president of the Canadian Study of Parliament Group and has previously worked at the Senate and House of Commons as a parliamentary counsel and at the Library of Parliament as an analyst. He publishes regularly in the Canadian Parliamentary Review and the Journal of Parliamentary and Political Law. Charlie is also on the editorial board of The Parliamentarian, the magazine of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and he is a regular presenter at Parliament, Law, and Legislative Drafting Conferences in Canada and abroad. Charlie, welcome to Witness to Yesterday.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm interested in the origins of the book in terms of your interest in Parliament, which clearly is a passion of yours, and I think it's been a part of your life for quite some time. So how did you get into a book that would look at all the crazy things that have happened in Parliament?
Well, I worked on the Hill for many years, and you hear stories here and there. People say things, you're like, oh, did you know about the time this or that happened? And I remember the first time I took the tour, and I thought, my goodness, this place is boring. Here's a room where people found compromise. Here's another room where people found compromise, but the composition of the room was different. And I thought, there's got to be something more than that. And so I was doing a series for a little while on social media called On This Day in Canadian Parliamentary History. And as I sort of dug into the Hansards, I saw all these amazing pearls that I'd never come across. And even for the stories that I heard, I often realized once doing a bit more digging that there was more to the story. It was even more exciting than people let on. And so over time, I sort of got talked into doing a book. Originally, I was thinking of doing some kind of like desk calendar. But once you start uncovering stories, you can't really stop. And there are a lot in Canadian parliamentary history. In many ways, this is the book that I sort of wish I had read when I first started on the Hill, to sort of find out all about the juicy gossip and drama of yesteryear, because there isn't really another source for it. There's a lot that you can find in biographies, but no one's ever taken the time to say, let's look at some of the wild and wacky things and put them all together in one place.
I saw on one of your social media feeds that on this day in parliamentary history, June 1st, the day we're recording this, that there was, I don't know if it's a protest, but a demonstration about the Canadian flags that people wanted. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, the flag debate on Parliament Hill was protracted as people debated over different designs, and there was a committee, and you can see many of them. And basically, there's this huge rally. I think it's 6,000 people, some in favor of the red ensign, some in favor of maple leafs. And I think the subhead in the newspaper was, it was a battle between God Save the Queen and O Canada, as people argued over sort of what the flags represented. I mean, there's plenty of wild protests on the Hill that have happened over the years. One of the more rambunctious one was actually during a railway workers' strike where they smashed windows in Centre Block and knocked off some art pieces and whatnot. And that's sort of the one we don't talk about very often. But there's also protests on the Hill that have involved nudity, both male and female, wow, and all sorts of wild things that you can imagine.
So the House of Commons, the Senate, Parliament, it's not quite the staid place of dignity that we like to think it is based on the stone and the purpose of debate and so on there. It's a bit of an unusual place where outlandish things happen. I'm wondering, why is this tension between the august surroundings that is Parliament and these almost disrespectful and unusual things that have happened there? How does that work?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, politicians are people. And people we know have their faults or flaws or foibles, just as anybody might, whether in politics or not. And politics sometimes brings out passions, sometimes fueled with alcohol. It can create some interesting combinations. So I think that we have an imagined view of the past where everyone was stately and decorous and, everything was in order. The history is far from that. We have incidents in the late 19th century involving firecrackers being set off in the chamber and people banging desks to drown out one another, right? But we don't talk about it, partly maybe because people don't know, partly because it's a bit unpleasant to admit we are just as bad as some other countries, perhaps neighboring ones that we often choose to mock in these respects. But I think it's truly, once you can have the prettiest building, right, and then fill it with politicians and see what happens. So I don't think there's really that much of a tension in the space versus the people, so much as we have this imagined view that it was always better once upon a time, or that people should rise to the occasion. The truth was there was a lot of drinking in the early parliamentary days. There was actually a bar underneath the House of Commons, and they would often go between votes and come back up under the influence. It's just we choose to think that they didn't. And so I do get that there's a juxtaposition. I always feel bad for the teachers that bring students to question period, having the whole conversation with them beforehand about, be polite and this, that, and the other, and here's how you're supposed to comport yourself as an adult. And then, of course, they see the behavior in question period, and the joke is always, really, did you set a terrible example for the students in the gallery that day? But variations on that theme you can find in press reporting back to the 60s and 50s. It's nothing new. I just think with television and social media, we probably see a bit more of it being clipped and fed to us rather than having to dig for it in, say, press archives once upon a time.
Yeah, I've been one of those teachers who has taken students to question period and see their jaws drop and when they see the antics and the behavior of members of parliament during question period, which leaves a lot to be desired, to say the least, doesn't it?
Depends on the day.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned newspapers, and one of the things that we like to talk about at the Champlain Society is Canada's history in documents, and clearly a lot of the history that you have researched has been in newspapers and Hansard. So I'm wondering how much the digitization of those sources has helped you as a researcher to write a book like this.
Yeah, I have tremendous appreciation and respect for those in the archive world. And frankly, this kind of book would be impossible to write, I think, even just a few years ago with the same level of sourcing. So there's a lot that we owe to Hansard for capturing, today it's a near verbatim thing. Once upon a time, it was more summaries of what happened. But we also have parts in history where things got purposely expunged from Hansard. So we have no record that something took place, and we have to rely on the press clippings. And for that, I'm grateful that we had such a robust parliamentary press gallery once upon a time. And to this day, they still do quite important work. So in sort of deciding what was in and what was out, obviously if something's in Hansard, you can rely on that as being, okay, here's the official report of it. But what the context was, or what was happening behind the scenes, or the other little details, often you're very reliant on newspapers. Where I got a bit scared sometimes is when you'd only see something reported in, say, one newspaper, you'd say, okay, well, did this thing really happen? So I had a lot of discussions about inclusion and exclusion, what's a reputable source and what's not, because even once upon a time in Canada, you have sort of humoristic publications and whatnot. And even in books written about Parliament, some people have been duped into believing mythology over the truth. And I also think it's helpful that we have newspapers in English and newspapers in French. And something that was very helpful for me is being able to compare, for example, what the story was, knowing that you had different journalists rather than just, for example, the same Canadian press story repeated in a whole bunch of papers. So when you start to weave them together, though, you started to see some really interesting inconsistencies. And this is a theme that you'll see throughout the book, even just how many protesters there were at a particular thing, or what exactly was the clapback that somebody gave that wasn't in the Hansard itself. And certainly acoustics in the chamber were a problem for some time. So I think some of that finds expression in the reporting being varied, but it makes it fascinating to see what was covered, what wasn't, even in cases that might involve more unseemly things where journalists said, epithets were used instead of writing out what was actually said. And you can tell some papers had more of a time with it than others. But it's certainly fascinating to see that we have this much documented. And even on the photographic side, just how many things have been digitized now. There's a photo in there of, I think it's the House of Commons Pages baseball team from like the turn of the century. And even just seeing what the pages look like, knowing that there's a description of them in some of the reference works as being younger men of shorter stature. But then you actually see the picture like, oh, okay, that is what that would have looked like once upon a time.
Yeah.
So honestly, being able to dig into the archives has brought a lot of things to life in ways that just, frankly, a passing reference in a reference work wouldn't do.
It's an interesting lesson in being a historian where you are weighing the quality of the sources and verifying through multiple sources to see that what you've read about once was it actually repeated in other places, and therefore finding a truth, because some things, I guess, were not true at first blush. For example, I think you write in your book about, I think it's the speaker who may have shot some rabbits outside Parliament Hill, but whether it's true
Yes.
or not, it took some investigation. What happened there, Charlie?
Yeah, so Speaker George Black, the first speaker from the Yukon, is alleged to have been annoyed at about 6 rabbits chewing up the grass, and so he reaches for a gun in his desk and out his window kills all 6 very
Right.
quickly and
This
orderly.
is 1932, I think,
Yeah,
just
I think
to
that's right.
verify
And
the year.
then the
Yeah.
question is,
Okay.
according to press reports, they were served in the parliamentary restaurant. And funnily enough, the Ottawa Citizen runs this story in several different decades as kind of a reminiscent, but in the more recent ones cast doubt, like we're not actually sure this ever happened, which is not a statement you get in the earliest of reportings. And in the Toronto Star at the same time, they have a report where they say, we have seen the 6 rabbits hanging from the, the freezer room, right? And you're like, okay, well, were those the ones he shot or did you just go out to the store and get some? Like, you don't really know what the story might be. But certainly there's interesting levels of doubt that have been cast on that story. And then there are journalists who are all in. And so what do you do with that? In the case of the book, I thought, okay, well, I owe it to the reader to say, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, here's where I found it. That's why the book might have one too many endnotes, as I wanted to be thorough in showing here's how I got to where I got. But there's always that risk that the source got it wrong or that there's some other explanation for what we've observed, which I think is what kind of makes history fun, right? And sometimes facts come out much, much later that if you had at the time, your whole perception of the story would have been different.
Right. And there are a lot of endnotes in the book, which is great. So you have the receipts, as the kids say today, about where you got your information from.
Yeah.
One story that is true, because there's photographic proof and solid proof in the newspapers and in Hansard, is the story of Jim Fulton, the British Columbia MP, who somehow got a salmon into the House of Commons and plopped it on the desk of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Tell us about that one, Charlie.
Yeah, so it's one of the more visually interesting moments you can see because we do have the video of question period for that day in October 1985. And he was upset about the salmonoid enhancement project. So to make a long story short, there were a lot of salmon that had some modifications to them, which allowed them to spawn, but there were too many of them. And so the government held a bunch of them back as to not affect ecosystems, the result being that fishers couldn't catch them and sell them. So this member's upset that fishermen in his riding can't make as much money. And to bring the point home, because he brought it up many times in debates and just the government was doing, well, keeping with its policy, I should say, he then, in a supplementary question, brings out a giant fish. Most reports put it at 12 pounds and being 3 feet or 1 meter. And questions swirl later on about how did he actually get it into the chamber? And this is where, again, the reporting is a bit inconsistent. I couldn't find anything contemporaneous to say what exactly happens. Something is implied about it was in his briefcase. And I'm thinking, well, that had to be a pretty big briefcase. And with this dripping wet fish in it, clearly you wouldn't have very much else in it. The consensus has been that he actually had it in his trouser pants, which does make a bit more sense when you see the video because the fish is on a rope that you could sort of easily tug out.
Right.
He walks it across the chamber. Unfortunately, the camera cuts to the speaker at that point, so we don't actually see the tossing, flinging, dropping. It depends who you read to see how much force and violence came with it, and whether or not he did in fact wave it in the face of the government House leader before putting it down on the desk. And I should note that fortunately the Prime Minister was away in the Caribbean for a Commonwealth conference at the time, and we do know that he did replace the blotter on the PM's desk before going out and parading his fish to the press gallery in an impromptu scrum after question period. And I probably should note here that props are not allowed to be used in debate, so certainly there was some uproar in the House,
right,
and some strong commentary on it, but it's certainly one of those moments where you would never expect someone to just raise a giant fish in the middle of a debate in the House of Commons during question period, but there you go.
Yeah, it's such a great story. And so not a myth, but I know there's one myth that you're pretty deliberate about dispelling in the beginning of your book, and that is this idea that people think that the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister are 2 sword lengths apart. And that's not true, is it?
Yeah, the story here is a bit of an odd one because you can find so many references to this and people just say it as fact all the time in Hansard. But when you do a bit of a deeper dive on it, I cannot find anything reputable that says this was in fact the distance and it was picked to prevent them from dueling, which is often the justification given for the length in question. What we know about Westminster, which is where the tradition is said to have originated, is that it was once a chapel and the width there was set to allow the priestly procession to go up on the altar. And so that was really the design at the time. And an author who wrote a recent book about that chapel says, in any event, Tudor MPs wouldn't be able to sit down if they have swords. There's very little to suggest members were showing up with swords in the first place. When it comes to the actual lines on the floor in the Westminster Chamber now, there's a 2010 pamphlet put out by the UK House of Commons, which is much clearer that it has been claimed the lines are 2 swords lengths apart, quote, although there is no evidence to support this, end quote. And so even in the Canadian official book, House of Commons Procedure and Practice, in the older edition, you'll say this relates to British practice, the distance, and then the new edition, that's just silent. So we have no authoritative source for this is why the distance is what it is. It's about sword lengths. It's about dueling. If anything, that's probably not the case. They weren't exactly showing up and dueling to begin with, but the chamber width, once upon a time, was meant for religious service.
Well, you certainly know your stuff, and that shines through in this book from the beginning to the end. And I want to talk to you a little bit about something you mentioned at the top of our conversation about there being a bar underneath the House of Commons. And I know there are a number of occurrences that, let's say that they were alcohol fueled. And I'm wondering, how big of a role was alcohol playing in the history of the House of Commons in these anecdotes?
Probably far too much of a role, if we're being honest about it. There is one particularly raucous night where, the firecrackers were happening, desks were being slammed, someone had a bugle, someone was imitating a cat. I mean, there's a lot happening. I believe the Globe and Mail says that Sir John A. Macdonald was, quote, thoroughly laid out in the common sense, I believe is how they describe his drunkenness there. And they said others who were equally drunk, but we will not name them for they did not disgrace themselves nearly as much as those we have named. We definitely see that alcohol was present. And certainly there are questions about who was drunk, how much they drank. There's a story about a member who was sort of called down when he stood up with cries of button your pants back up, which we understand to have been related to a particularly wild night. But it's not to say that all the alcohol stories are necessarily as debaucherous as others. So one that I'm fond of is actually a bit tame. It's if you read the Hansard, a member is giving a speech, suddenly stops, someone else starts, and then he, point of order, is to say, I just got a glass of water. I don't understand why I've lost my speaking slot. And we find out what happened in the press reports, which is that this member was particularly distracted and sort of giving this very long oration and didn't notice that someone had basically swiped out his water glass for pure whiskey. And so when he goes to take a swig of it mid-speech at a very unexpected moment and sort of flails to a page to bring him water, the whole house, we're told, is laughing uproariously. And if we're thinking about this logically, it probably was a member of his own caucus because you'd have to be physically proximate to sort of get onto the desk and not have him notice this, that, and the other.
Right.
But everyone saw it happen and enjoyed it very, very much, obviously, except for MP Casgrain, who lost his speaking slot. And I should probably say, as a non-drinker, I'd be very upset if someone replaced my water with something much stronger.
Right.
But to say members were playing pranks like that in the early years fairly commonly, including putting paper hats on one another who were sleeping and trying then at the next interval between speeches to make as much noise as possible to watch the hat fall off and the member act all confused. There's even an incident once upon a time involving book throwing between members in the chamber. So we just have all these stories where you might say at some point, if there weren't alcohol involved, would the same thing have happened? I'm not so sure.
Right.
But yes, the bar certainly contributed to some bad behavior. It was not reconstructed after the 1916 fire.
Right. And I'm curious to know, do you think when television came to the House of Commons in 1977, did that clean up the behavior of members of Parliament, or did it have very little impact on their behavior?
So this is one of the most divisive questions, I think, actually, in our current state, right? There are those who are firmly of the camp that everything got worse since televisation. I am more of the view that we now see it. All these sorts of bad behaviors have been happening, right? The fistfights that happened in the late 1800s, 1900s, we're not seeing fistfights in Parliament now. Instead, we're hearing, perhaps worse language than we're used to, or seeing people be a bit more aggressive towards one another. Well, I'd rather someone be aggressive with their words and potentially foul-mouthed than actually throwing a punch. There's definitely the question of our members playing for the camera, and in the social media age, we certainly see some things that you would never have seen years ago. For example, members not actually looking at the chair when addressing the speaker, but looking towards the nearest camera so they can clip it more easily for social media. So I do think televisation encouraged some bad behaviors, but there's some other things happening at the same time. MP wasn't a full-time job until the late 60s. They weren't hanging around Ottawa nearly as much. And so when it becomes becomes full-time and members also want to see themselves as legislators and think they need to do all these things to make the case to constituents, this, that, and the other, the incentive structure becomes different. And even for backbenchers, as you start adding to the chamber, well, that's more people competing for less time. There's an MP in the, I want to say, late 80s who goes on record saying the only way I could get attention on TV would be to moon the speaker at this point. Fortunately, he did not.
Right.
But it's certainly a challenge for members to get the attention. And if you put a camera, certainly people will act a little differently than if there weren't one. But I don't think we can blame all the ills of Parliament today, whatever they might be and whatever we might think of them, on the mere fact of televisation, because certainly we know from the historical record that there are people behaving badly since Confederation's earliest days. And in fact, I should say some of the more interesting moments in that regard occurred during secret sittings. So there are periods where the House meets in private with no transcription, obviously no television either. And one of the earliest is actually December of 1867, where we have a closed-door meeting where members want to get the government to prorogue. And the reason for that is because they got an amount per day, but also an amount per session. So if they had a prorogation, it would be a new session, so they'd get more money in their pockets.
Right.
And the funny thing is, if you're thinking back to early Canadian history, so 1867, Confederation, they don't really start sitting till much later in the year. I think this attempt to get more pay was something like 8 weeks into them being MPs. And they're like, no, we're not paid enough. Let's do this. The government didn't acquiesce to that. But certainly you could imagine if something like that had been televised, members, begging for more money mere weeks after starting their jobs, and all of them mostly being rich railway barons to begin with, it wouldn't have been a good look.
Right. Wouldn't have gone over as well. We talked earlier about the rabbits that the speaker shot at, allegedly. And there's other animal stories in your book too, as
Yes.
One might expect. I don't know. I think some of our listeners may actually remember or have interacted with the parliamentary cats on Parliament Hill. What can you tell us about those felines that everyone seems to know about? Because it's a fairly modern story, isn't it?
Yeah, the story that people know is certainly more recent, although the cats have a long history. They've been there for ages. And we know that for a time they were employed because of a mice problem. In fact, a member in the 50s gets up and says, because the cats were exiled last session, we now have a bigger mice problem. Can we please bring back the cats? Although if you go back to reporting from the 30s, there was a different problem, which was that the cats were quite loud when making love in the hallways of Parliament, and that members certainly didn't appreciate listening to. But by the time we get to the 70s, they're outside the building, and there's a woman caring for them. Eventually in the 80s, there's a little structure built for them, the so-called cat condominiums, and it becomes a tourist draw. So the tourists are loving these little cats in their little houses. You do see some members stop by to admire and occasionally pet them, even dignitaries. There's a story about the Dalai Lama going over there when he visited Ottawa. And it becomes such a popular attraction that they actually closed a donation box because they had too much money coming in. And they took out eventually letters to the editor in most local Ottawa papers to beg people to stop dropping their cats there, in part because cats would be rejected by the colony. It would be more traumatic for them than probably any other outing. Unfortunately, though, the cat colony had to go when renovations happened. I think 2013 is the year for that. But curiously, so beloved were these cats that when the last of the colony passed away, a cat named Cole last year, there's actually a New York Times write-up about his legendary life and that of the cat colony. So
Wow.
If you're really curious, go down that rabbit hole. There was actually a blog of the cats of Parliament Hill that I believe Library and Archives has preserved, so you can see the cat colony in all its glory.
Oh, great. And I'm curious, because of the number of anecdotes that you've been sharing with us today, which has been incredible. I think you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the crazy things that have happened on Parliament Hill. You must have had to cut some of them.
Yeah.
There must be a number of great anecdotes that are on your editing room floor.
Unfortunately, and some of them are things that I read somewhere and just didn't take the time to properly cite where I found it and then couldn't find it again, which is always one of those fun digital things, because there was a story I saw that was definitely about a Library of Parliament employee punching a member in the face in 1902. And I'm like, where? And I've never been able to find it again. So if anybody knows it, please let me know. But one that gets cut is an 1873 incident, if I'm not mistaken, where members at the time had desks that had locks in them, and somehow there's this member who's being all dramatic, but I have the proof that the minister lied and it's in my desk. And he doesn't have his keys. And then everyone starts throwing random keys at him. And this apparently goes on for a good 20 minutes as he tries basically everyone else's key, as he's completely lost his, potentially out of drunkenness, and is never able to open up the desk, and everyone makes fun of him extensively. But yeah, there's certainly a number of tales like that. I also cut a story that is completely true, that for a while the Parliamentary Library's copies of Playboy kept getting missing. And so the solution of then Parliamentary Librarian Eric Spicer was to put them in the rare book room, such that members needed to sign in and out for their access, and somehow that stopped the theft problem that had been occurring. So just little things like that have happened on the Hill that you just wouldn't think about.
Yeah, that's a great story. And I'm sure when you are at dinner parties and elsewhere, people must say to you, "What's your favorite anecdote, Charlie? Give us one of your favorites." So how do you answer that question when you're asked for a favorite anecdote?
I usually see how old the people are, and if they're of a certain age, I tell certain stories. But I'll keep it PG for this moment and tell you one of my
Okay.
favorites is there was a member of parliament named Dean Whiteway who was upset about post office hours in his rural constituency. And I think the town had like 400 people, if I'm recalling this correctly. And he gets up in Hansard early on in the session. It's 1974. And he says, I will basically camp out on the minister's front door until this issue is resolved. And sure enough, he makes good on the threat by buying a tent and setting it up in the Confederation building right outside the Minister of Post's office. And the visuals on this are just wild. I couldn't actually, for copyright reasons, get one in the book, but I'm hoping that will change in a future edition maybe, because he's dressed very much in a three-piece suit with gold cufflinks, and he's not in camping attire by any stretch of the imagination. And the floors are hard, so the tent pegs aren't going in. So the thing is held down by like glass ashtrays and whatnot, and just is visually hilarious. But on the top of the tent, he's put a little sign that says Hansard, the date, and the page number, because I guess he thinks people are going to stop by the tent and then pull Hansard from the library to figure out his concern. The speaker very quickly gets appraised of this use of the premises and orders the tent to be taken down, to which Mr. Whiteway is said to be relieved that the floor was, quote, rather hard, end quote. And a lot of fun is made of him because the minister basically says, look, I wasn't there the day he asked the question. He never approached me. I didn't know there was an issue. Would have been happy to talk to him like a normal human being.
Yeah.
And it turns out he used to be a school teacher. And there's some constituents who basically go on record to say, we would have expected better of someone who's supposed to know the process and how it works than to do a stunt like this. But
Yeah, that's good.
yeah, you just members expect the unexpected.
Yeah. You spoke about visuals, and your book does have a number of great photographs in it, which I think is excellent. And one of your favorites is one of the Minister of Agriculture at the time, Eugene Whalen, who gets splashed with milk. Tell us about how that happened.
Oh my goodness. Yes, if we could talk about supply management and all the various protests that have gone on there. But yes,
Right.
he'd angered the dairy farmers to a great extent, and Quebec dairy farmers in particular who come to the Hill with all sorts of butter, milk powder, any type of dairy product. And as soon as he sort of steps out of the building, there's this absolute maelstrom. And I love this picture because you can see the milk jug and the white specks of the various different pieces of butter and whatnot flying past them. And as the story is told, all he was able to get out were the words, I am your Minister of Agriculture, and then gets hit in the face and basically takes a quick retreat. So it's certainly a dramatic moment. I will freely say it's not the worst thing a member of parliament has been hit with. And I, at the risk of saying too much of the story about a member of parliament who accidentally found himself covered in excrement in the chamber, thanks to an unruly visitor. But yes, as we say, truth is sometimes stranger than fiction.
I'll say for sure. There's so many anecdotes there, Charlie. I'm wondering, when we look at your book in its entirety, and I know anyone who is a lover of Parliament and members of Parliament and senators and so on, people are going to love this book because it's so interesting. What do you hope readers will take away from this book?
So I'm hoping people will walk away and say Parliament is more interesting than we give it credit for, and walk away with the idea that people are people. If there are people who are holding themselves back from politics thinking, oh, I can't comport in this particular standard, where is that really coming from, right? This imaginary past. I'm also hoping that members who read it will maybe think twice before evoking some imagined past where everything was so perfect. It was never really the case on the Hill that we were always so polite towards one another. There's certainly been periods where we're less cantankerous, but in terms of sort of the wild, wacky, it's always been there. So I think really we should celebrate our own history, the good, the bad, the ugly of it. It's unfortunate to me that we know a lot of these stories from other legislatures. We certainly talk a lot about things that have happened in Congress and, the caning of one senator by another, but we never talk about our own stories that we have. And so I think some of it might just be that they weren't well known. Some of it, admittedly, is uncomfortable, but by not sharing and celebrating these things, I think we diminish all the color that the institution has. And I think even when talking to young people about Parliament, if we want to make them excited about it, we can't just keep it about the dry 3 readings of a bill. We have to talk about some of the more wacky things that have happened and just the characters that have come over the years. And that's not to say that I'm encouraging more people who are eccentric to run for politics or to do more things just to go viral. But I think we can present Parliament in a more well-rounded way that is more reflective of the history that it's had. And I'm hoping that this book does a little bit to make some people think, oh, Canadian history, not as boring as they led us to believe in school.
Well, you're preaching to the converted here, Charlie, as a former teacher of Canadian history and civics. This book should be on the desk of every civics teacher and history teacher in Canada, because it just has so many ways to illuminate young people and get them at least starting to build their interest in Canadian history and civics. So this is a great book. It's been great to have you on the podcast to share the stories of Canada's Parliament, Charlie. So thanks very much for participating today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest today was Charlie Feldman, the author of Unparliamentary, Tales from Canada's Colourful Parliamentary Past, published in 2026 by AVO UTP, an imprint of the University of Toronto Press. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. If you like what you heard today, please forward the link for the program to your friends and others who might be interested to hear it. Consider hitting the like button as well on whatever platform you heard us today. Or as my daughter says, smash that like button. The goal of the Witness to Yesterday podcast is to bring attention to the wonderful works of history that are published in this country on a regular basis. To find out more about the Champlain Society, please visit our website at champlainsociety.ca. To reach me or any of our hosts at Witness to Yesterday, drop us a line at info@champlainsociety.ca. We would love to hear from you. This podcast was made possible by the members of the Champlain Society, who work hard to bring to life original documents in Canadian history. We also want to thank a consortium of Canadian scholarly publishers for their financial support that includes the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press. We are also grateful for the support of the UTP Journal team. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. Today's episode was recorded on June 1st, 2026, and produced by Kevin Ball.